Then when Johnny went, come on over, when he called you over, well, that was it. Getting called over, there's nothing better than that. My first memories of Steve Allen, I remember being a small child. I remember I saw Steve Allen at the same time I first saw 12 o'clock on the clock at night. You know, it's one of those things when you're a kid, I know it's no different than seeing it in the daytime, but there was something about seeing it at night. I remember either I'd snuck out of bed, for some reason, the TV was on, and I saw, wow, 12 o'clock. And I remember seeing Steve Allen, and it just, you know, what is is it like the geese that bond with the first thing they see? I think that was like that. It was like, it's 12 o'clock, it's night, who's that guy? And there was something sort of wonderfully childlike about Steve Allen. He was like an adult who acted like a kid. He was loud. I was never a big fan of the throw a pie, put on a dress school of comedy. I like comedians like Carson, like Steve Allen, like Bill Cosby, who looked like normal men in everyday life, but then would act silly and do funny things. That, to me, was always the greatest comedians. They didn't need a prop. They didn't need to carry anything. The most Steve Allen ever had was he'd put on the hat and read from the, from the paper. I mean, that's kind of where headlines comes from Steve Allen reading letters out of the Daily News, and Mr. So-and-so says, by golly, and he would read the actual letter, and they were very funny. My favorite bit of Steve Allen's was, I always liked reality-based comedy. And he would, I remember he would take rock and roll lyrics and read them. I remember he reading Bee-Bop-A-Loopa, She's My Baby. It was the Gene Vincent song. I think it was Gene Vincent. Bee-Bop-A-Loopa, I don't mean maybe. And then he would look at the camera, and of course it was completely out of context, but those were the actual lyrics of the song. I mean, I like Steve Allen because it was always real comedy. It never was fantasy, The Man on the Street and Louis Nye. It all seemed to be happening right now and seemed very exciting. You know, I was so young at the time, I'm not sure if I actually had a favorite. I just liked the whole process. You know, growing up in an era of TV shows like The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, where everything was very scripted, on the Steve Allen show, it was a live show. Anything really could happen. A door would open and you'd see somebody do this who wasn't supposed to be there, and he would do that. You do that laugh, and you realize, oh, you're seeing something that's happening live that wasn't supposed to happen. And that was always the most exciting part of the show for me. Because back then, everything was so it was on film, and then they would transfer it, whereas this was live. I like being a part of an ensemble, and that's the thing with Steve. He was a great comedian, but was also a great straight man. Well, tell us, Mr. So-and-so. He would do whatever it was and play the straight man and then crack up halfway through the bit. That always made me laugh. Johnny Carson was different in that when Jack Paar came along after Steve, it was sort of maybe it was highbrow. I think TV in the 50s was a bit like HBO was now. In the early days of television, rich people had television. So consequently, you had Playhouse 90, the Kraft Music Theater. You had, kind of upscale programming to reach rich, wealthy people who would buy the big, just coming into vogue color TV or the black and white TV, and with the console and the whole deal. And Steve Allen would do, Jack Paar would do 90 minutes with Noel Coward. Well, try that now. Click, thank you, ratings, mayday, mayday, So it was more of a, I don't know if highbrow is the word, because that maybe sounds like I'm being insulting. I don't mean it that way. But it was more of a New York feel to it. Johnny Carson was a great populist comedian. A lot of things people don't realize, as well as Jack Paar did in the ratings, when Johnny Carson came on, I don't know if they doubled, but it was pretty close to it. I mean, he appealed, there are people who just thought, who maybe didn't get Jack Paar because he was Connecticut, he was New York. Whereas Johnny was America, he was the Midwest. Johnny was great because he never lost his sense of proportion. I always remember as a kid watching the Carson show, and Dean Martin walked out. And Dean Martin had some fancy Italian shoes on. And it wasn't scripted, at least it didn't seem to be. And Johnny said, "Whoa, where'd you get those shoes, sharp-looking shoes?" And Dean said, "Oh, these?" He said, "Oh, yeah, I had these custom made, $300. Now, $300 for a pair of shoes back in the 60s would be like, what, $1,500? And Johnny went, "Ooh." And he really had the sort of awe of the common man. You know what I mean? Johnny could buy Dean Martin shoes under the table all day long if he wanted to, but he wouldn't do, it wasn't his way. So he would go, just as the average person at home. He had a great common touch. He knew exactly what was too much, what was naughty, and what was dirty. He had a great sense of that. Even his clothes, when Johnny Carson had his line of clothes, they weren't way up here, and they weren't down here. They were just a little bit better than what the average guy could afford. You know what I'm saying? He never wanted to be the fanciest, the flashiest. You know, he was always the classiest. And he had, I think, all the elements. If there are 10 elements to do this, I think most people in late night TV at the most have 3 or 4 or 5. I mean, Johnny could play the drums, he could do a dance, he could take his shirt off and get thrown in the pool. Is there anybody on late night TV now you'd want to see with their shirt off? No, but Johnny could take his shirt off, and you know, men wanted to be him and women wanted to be with him, and he had that great boyish charm that really crossed just about every demographic group. Very much so. As a young comedian, when I would do this show, he was cheering you on, he would laugh, and the crowd would take their cue from him. You know, there are some talk shows where you'd be on stage and the host would be, "What's coming up next?" And the audience would, you know, watch that. Whereas Johnny always wanted you to do well. You know, you'd hear that. You'd hear him laughing in the corner with Ed, or he'd poke Ed, or he'd hit the table. And of course, this is a cue to the audience. Oh, you were accepted, you know. And then when Johnny went, "Come on over," when he called you over, well, that was it. Getting called over, there's nothing better than that. Oh, I think there are parts of Johnny Carson that every show like this tries to emulate. I mean, he did sort of set the standard for 30 years. Every show is a variation of this. You know, you have the desk and the chair and the whole deal, and everybody, when they start out, they're going to be different. They're going to put the chair over there and the desk up here. But eventually, it comes down to this basic format. Yeah. You don't change anybody's mind with comedy. You just reinforce what they already believe. If you try to change their mind, you know, then you go from comedian to humorist to social satirist to out of the business, really. I mean, if you go out and you do a joke about George Bush not being particularly bright, well, right now it will get a huge laugh because that's how he's perceived. If you go out and you go, "No, he's really smart because of this." So comedy is not particularly a brave act. You're just sort of following the crowd, and then you're getting the feel of it. There are times where you can sense it. I remember it was maybe 3 months or 4 months after 9/11. We were just testing the water to see how far we could go. And I remember saying to the audience, you know, if you don't laugh at this joke, that means the terrorists have won. And it got a big laugh, not because it was so funny, but just because people went, "Okay, all right, we can start loosening up a little bit and have some fun here." And there are those seminal moments that come every now and then when you do this. Very much so. I think that was Johnny's great strength. To me, there's nothing funnier than, "Well, Mr. Leno, you and your Democratic friends, I hope you're happy. Well, you and your Republican buddies, I hope you're happy." And it really goes with whoever you had that week. If Arnold Schwarzenegger was on, "I'm a Republican." If Joe Biden is on, "Well, I hope you're happy that you're pushing your Democratic agenda." So that was always my favorite thing. I always try to put the joke ahead of the political belief. I remember we had a young comic on one time, and I saw his set a couple of nights before, and his opening line was, "You know, I'm a Democrat." And I said, "Don't tell the audience that. They'll figure it out. You'll lose half the audience right at the start. Just do your material. Believe me, they'll understand where you're coming from." And that's what I try to do. We try to have a sense of balance. This is not a bully pulpit, so you want to keep it fairly mainstream, and the joke goes first. If I have a hilarious joke about the Democratic candidate, well, I'm going to go with it even if I'm for that candidate, because the joke comes first. The common denominator might be that all are fairly, not necessarily private people, but not necessarily, I don't go out to restaurants and party, and I go home, or I work in my garage, or I have my wife. Steve Allen, I know, wrote music. I know Jack Paar liked to take safaris and do the other things. I don't know how social he was, but I don't really remember seeing Tonight Show hosts in the tabloids getting arrested again outside of Sardi's. You know, I mean, there isn't a lot of that. They all seem to be fairly kind of private that way. But I could be wrong there. I mean, not to say they haven't been in that. I mean, Johnny would get in the tabloids occasionally when they're marriage or something. But he was not the type of guy that would show up all over the place, you know. Oh, I have no idea. That's the least of my problems, please.